Winter did not arrive gently in that land, it crashed down like an occupying force. Long before the first snowfall, the air itself began to change, growing sharper, heavier, as if warning everyone of what was coming. By late autumn, daylight shortened so drastically that the sun barely skimmed the horizon before disappearing again. When winter fully settled in, it did not leave for 7 long months. Snow piled higher than fences, winds screamed across open ground, and temperatures dropped low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. This was not the kind of cold that could be ignored or merely endured with thicker clothing. It was a cold that seeped into bones, tools, walls, and minds, slowly wearing people down. For families living in isolated rural areas, winter dictated every aspect of life. Roads vanished under snowdrifts, cutting off towns from one another. Supplies had to be stockpiled months in advance, because once winter sealed the land, there would be no second chances. A broken tool, a sick animal, or a single serious injury could spiral into catastrophe. Firewood had to be chopped and hauled in brutal conditions. Water froze solid. Even breathing outside felt like inhaling shards of glass. Every task required planning, strength, and luck. Most cabins were built with survival in mind, but survival was often just barely achieved. Thick log walls slowed the cold, but they could not defeat it. Fireplaces burned day and night, consuming enormous amounts of wood. Yet the warmth rarely spread evenly. Floors remained icy, corners stayed damp, and frost crept along window frames like a living thing. At night, families slept layered under blankets, fully clothed, listening to the wind batter the walls and wondering if the roof would hold until morning. The greatest danger, however, was not the cabin itself, it was everything that required stepping outside. Livestock were essential for survival. Animals provided milk, meat, labor, and sometimes the only reliable source of food when stored supplies ran low. But barns were separate structures, often dozens of steps away from the cabin. In summer, that distance meant nothing. In winter it could be deadly. Feeding animals meant trudging through waste, deep snow, fighting gale, force winds, and risking slips on ice that could break bones far from help. Every trip to the barn drained precious energy. In extreme cold, the human body burned calories rapidly just to stay warm. Fatigue set in quickly, and exhaustion was dangerous. A fall, a twisted ankle, or numb fingers that could no longer grip a lantern could turn a routine chore into a fatal mistake. Stories circulated quietly among neighbors, people who stepped out, just for a minute, and never made it back, found frozen along the path when the storm finally passed. Illness was another constant threat. Cold weakened immune systems, and damp conditions inside poorly ventilated cabins allowed sickness to spread fast. A simple cough could turn into pneumonia. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Infections that were easily treatable in warmer regions became life-threatening when travel was impossible. Women, children, and the elderly suffered the most, their bodies less able to endure constant exposure. Psychologically, the winter was crushing. Isolation intensified everything. Weeks could pass without seeing another person outside the immediate family. Silence dominated the frozen landscape, broken only by wind and the creaking of wood under thermal stress. Darkness lingered, pressing down on the mind. Hope had to be actively maintained, because despair came easily when each day looked exactly like the last, white, cold, and endless. Most people accepted these conditions as unavoidable. This was how life had always been, they said. You prepared as best you could, prayed for mild weather, and endured whatever came. Complaining was pointless. Changing things seemed impossible. Architecture followed tradition, not innovation, and tradition said the barn belonged outside, separate from the home, no matter the cost. But she saw winter differently. To her, the cold was not just a force of nature, it was a problem to be solved. She paid attention to details others ignored. She noticed how quickly heat vanished the moment the door opened. She noticed how people returned from barn chores shaking, breathless, sometimes ill the next day. She noticed how animals, clustered together in the barn, stayed surprisingly warm, even when the outside world froze solid. While others viewed winter as a test of toughness, she viewed it as a system with flaws, and systems, she believed, could be improved. Survival should not depend solely on endurance and suffering. It should depend on design, planning, and intelligence. The question that quietly formed in her mind was simple but dangerous: what if the way they lived was making winter harder than it needed to be? In that unforgiving environment, merely questioning tradition was risky. People clung to what they knew because change felt unsafe. Yet the stakes were too high to ignore. 7 months of winter meant 7 months of constant exposure to danger. Every unnecessary step outside was a gamble. Every wasted calorie was a loss. Every illness weakened the family's ability to endure until spring. This was the world she lived in, a world where winter did not forgive mistakes, where survival balanced on the smallest decisions, and where the line between life and death could be as thin as a snow-covered path between a cabin and a barn. The idea did not arrive suddenly, nor did it come in the form of a dramatic revelation. It grew slowly, quietly, the way real solutions often do, through observation, frustration, and long hours spent thinking while performing the same exhausting routines over and over again. Each winter day followed a predictable pattern: wake before dawn, coax a fire back to life, brace against the cold, and then step outside into a world that felt actively hostile. The short walk to the barn was never just a walk. It was a battle against wind, snow, and fear, repeated multiple times a day. At first, she assumed this was simply the price of living there. Everyone else did. No one complained openly, and when they did, it was half joking, a badge of toughness rather than a call for change. Hardship was worn like proof of belonging. If you suffered, you were doing it right. If you tried to make things easier, people questioned your resolve. This unspoken rule kept most ideas locked inside people's heads before they ever had a chance to breathe. But she could not ignore what she saw. The barn, despite being unheated, was always warmer than the outside air. When she stepped inside after battling the wind, the difference was immediate. The sting in her face eased, her fingers loosened, her breath slowed. The animals stood close together, their bodies releasing steady warmth into the enclosed space. Hay stacked along the walls acted like insulation. The thick wooden structure blocked the worst of the wind. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable, and sometimes, it felt almost warm. She began to notice how much time people spent just recovering from exposure. After returning from the barn, everyone hovered near the fire, shaking, silent, waiting for feeling to return to their hands and feet. Those minutes were lost energy, lost productivity, lost safety. Winter already demanded more calories, more wood, more effort. Why, she wondered, were they wasting so much of it fighting unnecessary cold? The thought felt almost disrespectful. Questioning the layout of a homestead was like questioning the wisdom of generations. Cabins were for people. Barns were for animals. That separation was as old as memory itself. People believed mixing the two invited disease, dirt, and bad luck. Some even said it was immoral, as if comfort itself were a kind of weakness. She tested the idea only in her mind at first, running through objections she already knew others would raise. What about smell? What about noise? What about cleanliness? What about tradition? Each question had an answer, but answering them aloud felt dangerous. Being labeled foolish, or worse, arrogant, could isolate a family just as effectively as winter itself. Still, the logic refused to let go. If the cabin and barn shared a wall, or even a narrow passage, then tending animals would not require stepping into lethal cold. Heat loss from the cabin would be reduced. The animals' warmth could be partially captured instead of wasted into the night sky. In a place where every degree of warmth mattered, that was not a small thing. It was the difference between exhaustion and endurance. She began paying closer attention to structures in nearby settlements, especially older ones. A few had storage sheds attached to homes, meant to reduce outdoor trips in bad weather. Those families fared slightly better each winter. Their idea had not gone unnoticed, but it also had not spread. People acknowledged it with a shrug and moved on. Nice, but not necessary, they would say. Necessary, she thought, was exactly the point. When she finally spoke the idea aloud, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Laughter came first, then disbelief. Some thought she was joking. Others assumed she had misspoken. When they realized she was serious, the tone changed. Warnings replaced jokes. People spoke of sickness, of animals bringing filth into living spaces, of fires spreading from one building to another. They told stories, some real, some exaggerated, of homesteads ruined by ignoring old rules. No one asked why she was considering it. No one asked how many people had nearly frozen on that short path to the barn. The discussion ended where it began, with the assumption that the way things had always been was the way they must remain. What frustrated her most was not the laughter itself, but the lack of curiosity behind it. Winter was killing people slowly, predictably, every year. Yet the idea of changing design to reduce suffering was treated as foolish. It became clear to her that survival in that place depended as much on social approval as it did on firewood and food. Standing out could be dangerous, but doing nothing was worse. She thought about the long term. Children growing up in that environment would inherit the same risks, the same exhausting routines, the same quiet acceptance of danger. If winter was going to dominate most of their lives, then their homes needed to respond to it intelligently. Comfort was not indulgence. It was protection. The idea gained strength each time a storm forced them to delay barn chores or rush through them carelessly. Animals suffered when they were not fed properly. People suffered when they moved too fast or stayed out too long. Everything was connected, yet the buildings themselves forced separation at the worst possible time of year. What others dismissed as convenience, she recognized as a survival strategy. The difference mattered. Convenience was optional. Survival was not. Connecting the cabin to the barn was not about making life easier. It was about making life possible for 7 relentless months. In the end, the decision did not come from confidence. It came from necessity. Winter was not going to change. The land was not going to soften. If they wanted a future there, something had to give. If tradition stood in the way of survival, then tradition was the problem. And so, while others laughed and shook their heads, she quietly committed to the idea. She stopped asking whether it was acceptable and started asking whether it would work. Once that shift happened, the laughter no longer mattered. Winter had already proven what it was capable of. She was simply choosing not to lose to it anymore. Turning the idea into reality was far more difficult than imagining it. Once the decision was made, the comforting simplicity of the concept gave way to hard questions that could not be ignored. How exactly would the two structures connect? Where would the passage run? How could warmth be preserved without allowing drafts, moisture, or animal waste to seep into the living space? In a place where mistakes were punished quickly by the cold, guessing was not an option. Every detail mattered. She began by studying both buildings as they already existed. The cabin had been built with thick logs not perfectly fitted, but sturdy enough to withstand decades of storms. The barn, though rougher, was solid and well positioned against the prevailing winds. Importantly, the two buildings sat close enough that a connection was possible without massive reconstruction. That small stroke of luck likely made the entire project feasible. Had the distance been greater, the labor alone might have made the idea impossible. The passage could not be wide. A large corridor would lose heat too easily and require materials they simply did not have. Instead, she envisioned something narrow and enclosed, just wide enough for a person carrying a bucket or feed sack. Narrow spaces held heat better. They were easier to seal and easier to reinforce. The lower the ceiling, the less air there was to warm, and the warmer it would remain. This was not about comfort or elegance. It was about function. Material choice became the next challenge. There was no store to visit, no endless supply of lumber waiting to be purchased. Everything had to be sourced locally or repurposed. Old boards were salvaged from unused fencing. Logs too crooked for walls were repurposed for framing. Gaps were packed with mixtures of mud, straw, and moss, traditional materials, but applied with uncommon care. She knew that even the smallest crack would invite cold air to slip inside and undo all their work. The ground itself posed another threat. Snowdrifts could bury a ground, level passage in days, turning it into a frozen tunnel or collapsing it entirely. To solve this, the passage was slightly elevated, resting on short supports driven deep into the earth. This allowed snow to blow underneath rather than pile directly against the walls. It also reduced moisture buildup, which could rot wood and create ice inside. Building during winter was impossible, so preparation had to happen during the warmer months, when time was already scarce. Every hour spent on the passage was an hour not spent on farming, repairs, or gathering supplies. Neighbors watched with quiet skepticism as the structure began to take shape. Some offered advice laced with doubt. Others said nothing at all, clearly convinced the effort would be wasted. She worked methodically, checking measurements again and again. The connection point into the cabin was chosen carefully, far enough from the main living area to limit noise and smell, but close enough to benefit from shared warmth. A heavy door was installed on the cabin side, sealed tightly, so the passage could be closed off if necessary. Control mattered. If something went wrong, she wanted the ability to isolate the spaces. Ventilation was another concern. Trapped air could grow stale or damp, leading to mold or illness. Small vents were placed high along the passage, designed to allow minimal airflow without creating drafts. These were covered and angled to block direct wind. It was a delicate balance. Too much airflow and heat would be lost, too little and the space would become unhealthy. The connection into the barn required equal care. Animals were unpredictable, and the passage had to be protected from damage. Reinforced barriers prevented livestock from wandering into the corridor. The opening was positioned near feed storage, minimizing movement and keeping animal traffic controlled. This also ensured that the warmest part of the barn contributed to the passage's temperature. As the structure took form, doubts crept in during quiet moments. Would it really make a difference? Would all this effort be worth it when winter returned? Failure was not just embarrassing, it could be dangerous. A poorly built connection could leak heat from the cabin, making things worse instead of better. But turning back was no longer an option. Too much time and hope had already been invested. When the passage was finally enclosed, the first test came on a cold autumn morning. Frost coated the ground, and the air carried the familiar bite of approaching winter. She stepped into the passage cautiously, half expecting to feel the same shock of cold she had known for years. Instead, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The wind disappeared. The air was still. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. That first walk-through felt almost unreal. No rushing, no clenched teeth, no burning lungs, just a steady, protected path between two shelters. It was a small thing, physically, but emotionally, it was enormous. For the first time, winter felt slightly less powerful. As the season deepened and snow returned in force, the real impact became clear. Chores no longer required mental preparation or recovery time. Trips to the barn happened more often and with greater care. Animals were fed properly even during storms. Supplies moved smoothly. Energy that had once been wasted fighting cold was now conserved. Inside the cabin, something else changed. The temperature stabilized. Heat lingered longer after the fire died down. Drafts lessened. The cabin felt more like a sealed space and less like a temporary refuge from the cold. The barn's presence acted as a buffer, shielding one side of the cabin from the worst of the wind and contributing subtle warmth. What had started as a risky idea slowly revealed itself as a system, one that worked together instead of against itself. The buildings were no longer isolated units battling winter independently. They supported each other, sharing heat, protection, and purpose. By the time the deepest winter arrived, when storms lasted for days and the world outside vanished beneath white silence, the passage had become indispensable. It was no longer an experiment. It was part of daily life. And though few neighbors admitted it openly, more than one stood watching with quiet interest, wondering if maybe, just maybe, she had seen something they had missed. The changes did not announce themselves dramatically. There was no single moment when someone declared that life had become easier or that winter had been defeated. Instead, the benefits crept in quietly, day by day, until they became impossible to ignore. What once felt like constant emergency mode slowly settled into something closer to stability. Winter was still harsh, but it no longer dominated every decision in the same way. The most immediate difference was physical. Fewer trips into the open cold meant fewer chances for the body to be shocked by sudden temperature changes. Hands stayed warmer. Lungs didn't burn as often. Muscles loosened faster instead of locking up from exposure. The simple act of moving between cabin and barn no longer required bundling up in layers, just to step outside for a few minutes. That saved time, energy, and, most importantly, strength. Energy conservation became one of the most underestimated advantages. In extreme cold, the human body burns fuel relentlessly just to maintain its core temperature. Before the connection, people returned from barn chores exhausted, not because the work was hard, but because the cold had drained them. Now, that energy remained available for other tasks. Woodcutting, repairs, cooking, and tending to children all became easier when the body wasn't constantly recovering from exposure. Health followed closely behind. Fewer chills meant fewer illnesses. Coughs and chest infections became less common. Minor injuries healed faster because the body wasn't under constant stress. Even sleep improved. When people are not shivering or waking repeatedly to feed a fire, rest becomes deeper and more restorative. Over time, this compounded into stronger immune systems and better overall resilience. The animals benefited just as much. Because tending them no longer involved braving storms, care became more consistent. Feedings happened on schedule. Water troughs were checked more frequently. Sick or injured animals were noticed earlier, before problems escalated. The barn itself stayed cleaner and better maintained, because it was easier to access. Healthier animals meant more reliable food sources, which fed back into human survival. Heat dynamics shifted in subtle but powerful ways. The connected structures created a buffer zone. Instead of the cabin being fully exposed on all sides, one wall now faced a relatively warm space. The barn absorbed wind and trapped heat, reducing thermal loss from the cabin. Fires burned more efficiently. Less wood was consumed. Over an entire winter, that reduction meant fewer dangerous wood, gathering trips, and less strain on already limited resources. Moisture control also improved. Because movement was easier, wet clothing could be changed more quickly. Snow wasn't tracked deep into the cabin as often. That reduced dampness inside, which in turn reduced mold and rot. Dry environments are healthier environments, especially during long winters when ventilation is limited. Small improvements in dryness had outsized effects on comfort and longevity of the structure. There were psychological changes too, though these were harder to measure. The constant dread associated with stepping outside during storms faded. Tasks that once inspired anxiety became routine again. This shift mattered more than anyone expected. Fear is exhausting. Removing it, even partially, gave people mental space to think beyond immediate survival. Plans could be made. Repairs could be done calmly instead of desperately. Morale improved in ways that surprised even her. Conversations felt lighter. Laughter returned more often. The winter no longer felt like an enemy that had to be endured in silence. When people are less exhausted and less afraid, they become kinder, more patient, and more hopeful. That emotional resilience proved just as important as physical warmth. Neighbors began to notice, even if they didn't say so outright. While others struggled through storms, this household remained steady. Their animals looked healthier. Their firewood pile lasted longer. They moved with less urgency, less visible strain. Quiet comparisons were made. Questions followed, tentative at first, then more direct. Some still clung to old objections, but the evidence was difficult to argue with. The feared problems, smell, sickness, chaos, never materialized. Clean separation and smart design kept living spaces sanitary. Ventilation prevented stagnation. Boundaries kept animals where they belonged. The risks people had warned about existed mostly in imagination, not reality. Perhaps the most important benefit was time. Time not lost recovering from cold. Time not lost tending to preventable illness. Time not lost rushing through dangerous conditions. In winter, time is life. Every saved minute adds up over 7 long months. The connection didn't shorten winter, but it made winter manageable. By mid-season, the change was undeniable. The cabin and barn no longer felt like separate worlds. They functioned as parts of a single system, each supporting the other. Heat, labor, and care flowed more efficiently. Survival stopped feeling like a series of desperate reactions and began to resemble something planned, controlled, and sustainable. The design had done more than provide warmth. It had changed the rhythm of winter itself. And in doing so, it revealed a truth that many had refused to see: the environment might be unforgiving. But human ingenuity did not have to be. By the time the 7th month of winter dragged toward its end, the difference between those who endured and those who barely survived had become unmistakable. The land was still frozen, the sky still pale and unwelcoming, but inside that connected cabin, life had found a steadier rhythm. What once felt like a constant fight against exhaustion and fear had transformed into something quieter, more controlled. The design was no longer just an improvement, it had become the reason they were still standing. Storms came one after another, some lasting days, others burying the world in snow so deep that familiar landmarks vanished. In past winters, these storms meant confinement, anxiety, and calculated risks. Animals still needed care. Fires still needed fuel. People still needed food. But now, even when the outside world was completely sealed off, daily life continued. The passage between the cabin and barn functioned like a protected artery, keeping everything alive and moving when everything else stopped. In moments of crisis, the value of the design revealed itself most clearly. When winds howled loud enough to shake walls and visibility dropped to nothing, stepping outside would have been unthinkable. Before, that would have meant delaying feedings or rushing through them dangerously. Now, the animals were reached safely, calmly, No frostbitten fingers. No panic. Just routine, even in chaos. Routine in winter is survival. Illness struck the region hard that year. Cold, damp cabins became breeding grounds for sickness, and travel was impossible. In other homes, coughs deepened into fevers. Strength drained away just when it was needed most. In the connected cabin, sickness still appeared. It always did, but it did not spread with the same severity. Warmer, drier conditions and reduced exposure allowed bodies to recover. Care was easier to provide. Firewood lasted longer. Small advantages stacked together until they became decisive. The animals, too, endured the winter better than ever before. Healthy livestock meant reliable nutrition: milk, meat, fat, all critical during the leanest months. When one animal showed signs of distress, it was noticed immediately. Early intervention prevented loss. In places where a single animal could mean the difference between hunger and survival, that awareness mattered more than comfort or convenience ever could. As the winter stretched on, neighbors began to change their language. What had once been dismissed as a foolish experiment was now referred to with careful respect. People asked questions framed as curiosity rather than criticism. They wanted to know how much wood was saved, how the air stayed clean, how the animals were kept separate. Some admitted, quietly, that they wished they had done the same before winter arrived. But the true legacy of the design was not in admiration. It was in endurance. When spring finally hinted at its return, there was no sense of having narrowly escaped disaster. There were no bodies broken by frost, no animals lost to neglect, no resources drained to the brink. The household emerged tired, yes, but intact, strong enough to rebuild, plant, and prepare again. The connection between cabin and barn had quietly rewritten the rules of survival. It proved that winter did not have to be met with brute endurance alone. Thoughtful design could reduce risk, conserve energy, and protect life. The solution was not technological or expensive. It required no new tools, only a willingness to question tradition and observe reality honestly. Years later, variations of the idea spread. Some built enclosed walkways, others shared walls. Some designed entire homesteads around heat flow and movement efficiency. Few remembered where the idea had come from, but many benefited from it. The lesson endured even when the story faded. What she built was more than a passage. It was a statement that survival does not belong only to the strongest, but to those willing to adapt. In a land ruled by 7-month winters, that understanding was the difference between being buried by the cold and outlasting it.